So our next panel follows on the conversation we just had with the taskers, drivers, and freelancers who are working in this economy. And we're very fortunate to be joined by three people who are deeply involved in the discussion about the legislation in the city of Seattle regarding collective bargaining. And as I mentioned before, there's been a little back and forth between several parties involved in this discussion over the last 24 hours, and I want to acknowledge from the very beginning that this panel does not represent all of the parties. However, I believe this panel represents all of the parties who are talking about the progress of the legislation, and that's specifically where we would like to focus this. In December, Mike O'Brien, our city councilman, authored and passed legislation allowing collective bargaining in the city of Seattle for drivers. Dawn Gearhart, who is an organizer for the Teamsters Union and participant in the App-Based Drivers Association, has been involved in this debate and engaged with Uber many years ago to talk about how to bring their services into the city. And it was a font of good background information for me as I did research on this topic. And finally, John Kirkwood, who is a professor at the School of Law at Seattle University, who has been looking at the legislation and its relation to antitrust legislation or antitrust rules nationally as well as within the state of Washington. And so where I'd like to begin, and I'd like to start with Dawn. A few years ago, you began to have some dialogue with drivers who were looking for alternative ways to get dispatches. How did that conversation begin, and where has it led us besides the App-Based Drivers Association?
Sure, that's a great question. So, yeah, like you mentioned, I work for the Teamsters Union. It's a really traditional union, and normally you have to be an employee to get a collective bargaining agreement, and you have to be an employee to be a member of a union. But we had been approached by a group of taxi cab operators. This is prior to the introduction of services, of app-based services here. And they just said, we're having a number of issues, and we feel that our dispatch companies are outdated, and we'd like the opportunity to connect with passengers in a quicker, more efficient way since we're on the road. We started working with those drivers back in 2012. They were able to make great strides in the work that they wanted to do. They set up their own association. It's a democratic organization with its own bylaws and its own elected board. And that board makes the decisions about what they want to see happen in their strategic goals, and we work together with them through a contractual agreement to help reach those goals. That was in 2012. In April of 2013, I received a letter that had been sent to all local unions in the area, and it was from an Uber driver who was actually a law student at Seattle U at the time, and he said, you know, I was the first Uber driver in Seattle. I think there's a lot of issues with the company right now. We were told we were going to be partners. We met with the CEO. And we're just trying to find out if we're being exploited or if we have rights to organize. Can you help us? All the other local unions contacted us and said, we're not going to take this on. And so I met with that driver. His name is Daniel, and at that time there were 200 drivers working for the company. Now there's about 7,000 from what we understand. And so we started working with those drivers. They formed the App-Based Drivers Association in 2014. They were able to make a lot of progress, but it was primarily the drivers of town cars. That was the first Uber service that was in Seattle. And what they really wanted was partnership with the company. They wanted the option to get a tip. They wanted the option to have clarity on rates and when those were going to drop. And so we started working with them towards some of those goals, and that's what ultimately led us to working on this legislation last year.
So just as a statement of fact, over the last year, the rates that Uber and Lyft have paid have dropped by about 40% here in Seattle on a per mile basis. Nationally, it's gone as low as 50%. Now, there are a variety of reasons that's happening. There's a price war going on between Lyft and Uber, for instance, and each is vying for market share. On the other hand, the price of gasoline has dropped by more than 50% over the last year, and the cost of driving has, of course, gone down with it. And that has created a sense of deep pressure on the drivers. In talking with Don Creary and preparing for the panels as well, you know, he talked about a decline in his revenue, not a precipitous decline that prevents him from driving. He's obviously still driving for Uber and Lyft. And it's interesting to me that Uber and Lyft drivers tend to arbitrage the two services, looking for the best available current fare and then choose which brand they represent at that time. Now, Mike, you passed legislation in order to allow these drivers to collectively bargain with these organizations. The reason for that is because Seattle is trying to set certain standards for itself as it moves into the future. Can you talk about what the political questions you had to balance in making the decision about how to author that legislation?
Sure. So there is a big question about, you know, who is Seattle? Who are we here in Seattle? What do we want to be as a city? What do we want to be as a community? What do we expect our economy to look like? And there's a couple frames I look at. We certainly see ourselves, and I embrace this in part, as this innovative technology center here in the Northwest. Take a lot of pride in all the innovation, all the companies that are started, that are based here in Seattle, all the innovation, frankly, that comes out of this area. And I think the exciting part about that isn't so much that we get listed on the front page of magazines nationally, it's that that type of innovation can really help elevate people that live here in our communities. What's happening now, though, when we look at what's happening with Uber and other companies, is there's this mix of very innovative technology, very new business models, but also this kind of throwback to a century before where folks are profiting off a race to the bottom for their workers. You know, this idea that all boats are rising and we're all going to do well is really being decimated. And we hear that specifically, I hear it most from a lot of the folks that are driving in this industry and have been driving in this industry for years, often decades. One of the interesting things is, you know, you think about folks who've been driving in this industry. In Seattle, it's largely immigrants, a big portion of folks from East Africa and India. And you know, if any of us worked in a certain industry and all of a sudden that industry took off, we would think of that as an opportunity. Now, I have expertise in, you know, before I was on the council, I was a CFO at a law firm. And if all of a sudden the world shifted and everyone needed more finance people, I'd be well positioned to take advantage of that. And yet something's happened where there's so many more driver services, and yet the folks that have the expertise in this are frankly being left behind, and their wages are being driven down to the bottom, as opposed to this being an opportunity where they're elevated. And it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, there are lots of different business models out there, many that are successful, some that really support their workers, and some that take advantage of their workers. And I think as a city, I want to make sure that we're a place that does embrace innovation, that embraces technology, embraces new business models, but does it in a way that supports everyone throughout that ecosystem. Folks that are new workers or been there a while, folks that are running the companies, they're investors, everyone should be able to benefit. And that's not what we're seeing right now in the TNC, the transportation network companies.
Now, a transportation network company is an old-fashioned phrase, and we talk about mobility companies today. The evolution here is that these marketplaces have come together to allow people who need a ride or something delivered to ask for mobility. Is the underlying idea of a transportation network company perhaps part of the what's holding us back?
It may be in part. I mean, you know, the taxi industry itself, you know, up to a couple years ago, very heavily regulated industry. And, you know, as I learned in my economics 101 class when I was in college, you know, we'll see certain patterns that happen in these heavily regulated industries. And frankly, a lot of that played out in the taxi industry. And I put a lot of the blame on government for not updating our regulations. You know, we hadn't issued a single new taxi license in something like 23 years in the city? 25 years. There's been a lot of change in the city in 25 years, and yet we're not keeping up with it. And the industry, you know, the results reflected it. You know, customer service wasn't great. There wasn't incentives for folks to be creative and try new models. You know, we regulated so much, there was no room for innovation. And so I accept that, you know, the system has failed and government has played a part in that. And we need innovation, and there's parts of what's happened in the last few years that have been great. Certainly consumers really appreciate that there's new options and new opportunities. And so how do I, as a government regulator, embrace that innovation, but also recognize that those regulations weren't in place just because we love regulations. They were designed to do something originally. And how can we be innovative in our regulations? What are the things that are important for us to set standards on and get out of the way in other places so the market can evolve and innovate? And so, what the name is, whether we call them TNCs or whatever, I do think that government itself needs to rethink what we want to regulate in this industry. And that's where I think allowing collective bargaining, I think there's a path there that allows workers to have some power, some voice, some leverage in negotiations for what's best for them, and allows government to step back and make sure that your brakes work, that you have insurance, and stay out of the rest of the marketplace.
So now the legislation has been passed. It applies here in the city of Seattle. And John, this is a question for you. And we had a complicated conversation about antitrust law from my perspective as a non-lawyer, which I don't want to try to repeat here, obviously. But in order for a city to regulate and provide a collective bargaining agreement, there needs to be an exception to federal antitrust law. Has that exception been created in this situation, and what do you foresee in terms of challenges to this law based on the way it was authored and constructed?
Sure. The legislation does raise antitrust issues. Mike and the City Council are well aware of them, but there are still substantial problems, maybe not fatal, but significant issues with it. Perhaps the best way to see the antitrust problem is for me to take you back to Washington, D.C. in the 80s, where a group of independent contractors provided representation for indigent criminal defendants. These were contract attorneys, and they were being paid miserably. So both they felt, and many outside commentators felt, that the rates the DC government was paying these workers didn't provide them a living wage and didn't give adequate representation to their clients. They decided to do just what this legislation would authorize the workers of Uber and Lyft to do. They decided to act collectively. They formed what was in essence, though not legally, a union. They made a presentation to the DC government calling for higher compensation. The government rejected it, and the contract attorneys went out on strike. They refused to work, and as a result, they brought the DC criminal justice system to a halt. In turn, the DC government capitulated, raised compensation substantially. But at the same time, the Federal Trade Commission sued. The case went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and the court ruled unanimously that this violated the antitrust laws. It amounted to price fixing and a group boycott, because the workers who had been competing with each other to take these cases had acted collectively, got leverage or market power they wouldn't otherwise have. So to avoid antitrust liability, there has to be an antitrust exemption. If the workers were employees, they would have the federal labor exemption, which allows them to unionize. But if they're independent contractors, they have to have what's called a state action exemption. And that's actually easy to follow. It says a state, not a city, but a state can eliminate competition in a market as long as it clearly intends to do so, and two, actively supervises the resulting coordination or collective action. And there are problems with the legislation here, maybe not fatal, but problems that could tie it up in court and could ultimately overturn it. Problem one is on the clear intent requirement. The state of Washington has allowed, as Mike just told you, has allowed the city of Seattle to regulate the product market here, regulate entry and prices for taxi services, and presumably for hire services as well. But there's no clear intent to displace competition in the labor market. The state of Washington has not clearly authorized Seattle to allow collective bargaining in the labor market. That's problem one. Problem two is on the active supervision requirement. The legislation creates a supervisory body, the Division of Finance and Administration, but as far as I can tell, the ordinance simply has that division supervise the process, but not the outcome. So it makes sure that there's been an appropriate number of drivers to form an association, that the bargaining process works, and that if they have to turn to arbitration, it's goes according to the particular procedures. But the legislation doesn't seem to allow, and maybe Mike can say it does, but it doesn't seem to allow the Division of Finance to reject a collective bargaining agreement if it would have an adverse impact on consumers, if the increase in wages would produce an unreasonable increase in prices. So again, I can go through counter arguments, but I've talked enough. I'm just here to present those issues.
So you can see how a regulatory light hand is not necessarily easy to achieve in this environment. Dawn, you were going to add something.
Well, I'm not an attorney, and I'll let our council member here talk about the specifics of the actual language and how it's written, but I do want to just address the last point. He mentioned an adverse impact on customers. So I think you heard from Mitch about the current situation with drivers where the rates have gone down drastically. I'd like to go back to when UberX entered into Seattle back in 2012. The rate then was about $2.35 a mile. Taxis were $2.70 a mile, which is a rate that the city had set. They set it at that amount because they thought that was fair to passengers. There'd be transparency for customers, and drivers would make about $10.83 per hour at that rate if there were 900 taxis. So that's how it was set. They also set the rates for flat rate cars and other types of for-hire transportation. But when the city decided for the first time that they were going to try to regulate these transportation network companies, thousands of people reached out to the city council and said, I love this service. I think this is so convenient. I'm going to replace my current vehicle and just use UberX. And that was when the rate was $2.35. The rate for UberX in Seattle is $1.35. It's the highest in the country right now. In New York, it's $1.20. In San Francisco, it's 90 cents. In Detroit, it's 30 cents a mile. And when drivers started working for these companies, they thought they were going to be independent businessmen who were going to make a choice about the work they were going to do with flexibility and an ability to provide a great service to customers. And so even if in the miraculous circumstance that workers are able to come together, collectively bargain, Uber, for example, sits down and negotiates with them, and they get a 40 or 50% wage increase, which we never ever see in union negotiations. Customers are still going to be paying the same amount that they were paying 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when they said they loved this service and they wanted this service and they were using this service primarily for transportation. So even if it were to happen that rates would go up, I don't think that what we've seen from the public is that there would be an adverse impact on them. I think drivers would still be making a very low income because at that time there were only a few hundred, now there are several thousand. But what I do think is that companies like Yellow Cab and Lyft and Uber would be competing on a service rather than a race to the bottom, rather than who could charge the lowest amount per worker, per hour, per minute, and get the most trips in that amount of time. I think the goal of people in Seattle, as far as we've seen when we work on innovative policies like $15 an hour, paid sick and safe leave, is that people believe we can have growth in technology, we can have growth, a booming economy, but that doesn't mean that we have to increase the amount of inequity between workers or the huge amount of people who are at the very bottom working their hardest, working 12 hours a day to try to make a living. That's less than $3 an hour.
And so, Mike, where do you want to take the city of Seattle in terms of supporting this kind of change in our transportation patterns? How can the city work with an Uber or Lyft in order to understand the changing patterns and the other opportunities for ancillary services besides getting somebody from place A to B? Uber Eats, for instance, will be on a panel later. Looking at those kinds of potential positive impacts on local restaurateurs, on local food sourcing. What does the city need to do in order to be a good partner for those companies, and what has been your experience in trying to, and this is not a question specifically about Uber or Lyft particularly, but what is your experience in talking with these companies about how the community can make a different future for itself?
Well, those are really good questions, and I think long and hard about what what is our role or my role as a council member, as a regulator, as government, what is our responsibility to the people that live and work in Seattle? And we clearly have a role to set regulations, but what's the framework in which we set those regulations? And I believe that our job is to do enough regulation to set a playing field that's fair, but not so much that you stifle innovation. And unfortunately, what I was taught, so I have an undergraduate degree in economics and I have an MBA in finance, and what I learned coming through the education system was about how this capitalist system was supposed to work, and there's this supply and demand, and when workers are in short supply, they have leverage, and Uber and Lyft would be competing for drivers, and they would be outbidding each other to try and pay more for drivers. The reality that we're seeing in this specific market, and frankly, at a lot of low-wage jobs throughout our society, is that there are way more workers that have absolutely no other option. And their only choice is to take what's left on the table for them. And so when they start to work for Uber at $2.35 an hour, and then over the course of a year it goes down to $1.30, their choice is to stay home and make nothing and still be paying the debt on the car loan they took out to go into work, or to take the $1.35 and at least they're losing less than if they stayed home.
Well, let's be clear, it's not per hour, it's per mile.
Per mile,
Yeah.
thanks, yeah.
Right. But,
Thank you.
so small capitalism is sort of the promise of the future of the U.S. economy as far as the rhetoric of this industry. And it doesn't sound as though you see that evolving here.
I don't see that evolving here. I mean, I actually can envision a path where it does evolve here, but I don't think that's where we are right now. And I think, one role that we could play, and I think it's much clearer legally that we could go into this space, is we could simply say, just like we do with taxis, Uber, you have to charge $2.35, and you have to pay, $6 for a delivery of a lunchbox, and you have to pay, we could go through and just set up a whole tier of schedules, but that gets us right back to where we were 25 years ago on this heavily regulated industry. It may be that that's what the courts allow us to do, but I think a much more creative thing to do is how do we allow the workers in this industry to have some voice, to have some leverage? As Dawn said, what they wanted to be is like, we want to be partners in this. The workers benefit when the market's expanding, when they have more customers too. How can they share in the prosperity with Uber? And instead what we have right now is, in Uber's case, this company that's valued at $63 billion, and drivers who are working full-time, when they deduct all their expenses, say they're making less than $3 an hour. And the playing field is so out of balance, the power dynamic is so out of balance, that one side just says, these are the rules that we're gonna set, you take it or leave it. If you don't like the rules, it's no big deal for us because someone else will come and play. And what we're left with is a society, and we chatted about this before, Mitch, the legend of Henry Ford was, I want my workers to make enough money to afford my product. But the drivers for Uber and Lyft today can't afford to use their own product when they want to go out on a date or see a movie with their family. And that is really a tragedy that I think a city like Seattle needs to avoid.
And so, John, as a litigator, you advise people who are in conflict about this. What would you advise the city and the on-demand companies to put on the table in order to have a constructive conversation about the depth and flexibility of regulation?
Well, that's a challenging issue.
Yes, it is.
As Mike suggested, the safest regulatory form would be a form that regulates on-demand services like Uber and Lyft the way they regulate taxis, and creates a single regulatory structure for both modes of transportation. And in the process, make sure that whatever gains workers have don't produce unreasonable prices for consumers. That would work. But short of that, it'll depend on what Uber and Lyft are willing to do. If they treated their workers better, this issue would tend to go away.
So some facts about the success or failure of the small businesses generally is good context for this as well. We know that Uber and Lyft both see about 60% churn in their driver population on an annual basis. Later today, we're going to hear from Home Advisor, who's in the home repair business. They have, somewhere in the same order of churn because small business people like roofers or fence repair guys go out of business at an incredibly high rate because they can't manage the basically cash flow on an ongoing basis. So is there a way, for instance, in the city of Seattle for the city to create a shared resource that could be helpful to these smaller businesses in terms of either leveling out the revenue over the course of time to help them better balance and manage their businesses, or in any other way, then we would have to think very creatively about it, provide services that help them put together a more complex and more rewarding living. Is that something that we could think about at this point?
I think that that's probably a direction we're going. One of the challenges is, I know both people that are relatively new to the driving field and have taken this up as a part-time gig. We hear them come testify. But I also know that there are thousands of folks that for years have made their living supporting their family full-time as a taxi driver, as a for-hire vehicle driver. And what I hear Uber saying more recently is, well, our employment is never meant to be a full-time job. We're just looking, this is just a part-time, make a few extra bucks. But imagine a world where all of us who have full-time jobs start to lose those jobs because someone sets up a system where anyone can kind of come do that job part-time and erode our ability to make a living. I can tell you that if someone did that to tech workers at Microsoft or Amazon, government regulation would react swiftly because of the people whose jobs would be taken away. Unfortunately, when the jobs we're talking about are largely held by immigrants, we do not react as swiftly, and we didn't in this case. I mean, when Uber first started, they were clearly operating outside of all laws and regulations, and yet we as a city did not step in and stop them. And I take some responsibility for that, and I'm frankly not proud of that. And so we look forward to, okay, so if the world is evolving where these are going to be, we're going to make a living not by going to work at IBM when I'm 22 and retiring 40 years later with a pension, but doing part-time things and jumping around, and when opportunities arise, I try them. We need to have a structure in place that makes sure that our basic needs are taken care of. These drivers don't get Social Security because they're not employees. So how are their pensions going to take care of? They don't have benefits like health care. Where are they going to get health care? I'm not saying that that model can't work, but we need the structure in place. And I recently read an article that some of you probably saw talking about the Scandinavian countries, very socialist countries, are also some of the places where we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of high-tech companies are starting there. And the argument was made because these companies are not responsible for retirement, healthcare, education, because government has said this is a public responsibility. We're going to make sure all of our people are taken care of. It gives a lot more flexibility to companies. And if we had a system like that, and we have a socialist on our city council, we have a $15 an hour minimum wage. We're a long ways from the types of government where in Norway or Sweden where as parents you get a year's leave when you have a kid. Education is paid for all the way through college. Healthcare is automatic for everyone. But if we had a system like that, I think there's a legitimate argument that could really make it much easier for companies to come in and innovate because they wouldn't be responsible for all the aspects of their workers. But right now we're not there.
So if anybody has questions, please raise your hands. We should have a microphone out in the audience. The other thing is I wanted to stop for a moment and introduce Henry Yates, who contacted me yesterday with concerns about the representativeness of this panel. Do you have your mic? Okay, great. And I would just echo that not only did Henry issue this concern, so did Uber. And so I wanted to make clear that this is not an attack on anybody. This is trying to get to a discussion about how do we move forward and move forward as a society where we can all begin to thrive. Henry, please just a few words about why you're here and what are your concerns on this topic.
Okay, my name is Henry Yates, and I have a public affairs firm, Yates Consulting, and I represent what's called the Flat Rate for Hire Vehicle Association, and that group is, much like taxis, independent contractors drive the vehicles. We've been in existence since about 2007 and grown quite rapidly. Started with about 7 cars, and now there are more than 400. But we have lodged consistently an alternative perspective on this legislation. Well, not legislation, but this law that passed that essentially would unionize taxi drivers, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if Dawn mentioned that she's part of the Teamsters union, but that is what is driving this.
I did.
Oh, okay, good, good. That is what's driving this entire change in the way things are done in this city with the app-based and other for-hire services. So, couple of things. The first is that the drivers in our association are doing well, and I say that with no reservations. They are making significantly more than what was talked about here. Our belief is that there are probably a few that are making not a lot of money, but our folks are doing pretty good. Many of them go back and forth between our services, and they sometimes drive for Uber, they sometimes drive for Lyft. Same is true with taxi cabs. And they talk all the time, and they believe that the Uber drivers are doing okay as well. Now, you can always be in a situation where you're making more money, and that's what everybody wants to do. And I think that it's somewhat to say that the average driver, which is pretty much what I heard here, is making $3 an hour, is not what I have heard from drivers. So, as Councilmember O'Brien said, many of these drivers are immigrants and refugees. A lot of them are from East Africa and other countries as well. And many of them have a different cultural way of interacting in their country. And of course, it is also manifested here. And there's a couple of things that make them gravitate towards this industry. Many of them have religious issues that require prayer several times a day. You can't do that in a regular, quote, unionized workforce where, you know, you're getting 15 minutes of break every 4 hours or whatever. Many of them find a need to go back to their home countries. I mean, just like all of us, you know, we have parents or relatives that we must care for sometimes because of issues. Well, for a lot of us, flying back to Philadelphia or California is not a big deal. For these folks, it's sometimes an hour and a half one way, a day and a half one way to get to a place like Mogadishu. The other issue is a lot of our folks have very large families, and they got to take the kid to the doctor. And if you're an independent contractor, if you are not being told you have to be here, you have to be there at this time or that time, you have the flexibility of actually taking your child to the doctor when the doctor is available, which I know is a struggle for a lot of us that don't have large families, but for these folks it's especially onerous. So this independent contractor model, this model, the way it's working now, which many of these immigrants and refugees have benefited from for many years, is a good system. It can be made better, and there was some talk about how to do that, but we are very much interested in entertaining that. I will have to say that the entire structure, regulatory structure of the taxi cab, TNC, and for hire business changed over the course of actually a couple of years, and that significantly changed the way that drivers and companies interact with their clients and the government. This particular piece of legislation only took a couple of months, and it probably has an even bigger impact on these folks. And there really weren't that many of these folks that were consulted. So I would like to end by suggesting to everyone here, and I suspect most, if not all of you, are taking either Uber or Lyft to wherever you're going on a regular basis. And I would ask you to not take my word for how well these drivers are doing, but to do what Cecily did. She talked a little earlier in this session, and actually get in the car and talk to the driver. Ask the driver what they did before, whether this is a decent system for them, and why they are doing what they're doing as opposed to doing something else. So thank you.
Thank you. You know, by the way, I do that with Uber drivers all the time, and I do think that Uber drivers generally are very happy with the living that they are able to extract out of this. They're challenged by the lower prices, certainly, but they like the flexibility, and in many cases they're trying to start other companies. Now, a couple of clarifications. I want to make sure that we're clear about the nature of this legislation. This is not a closed shop kind of a legislation model. This is an option for people to organize and collectively bargain, but that is not to control the market. Is that correct or not correct?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. And Henry and I have worked together a lot on this, and we might disagree on the specifics of this legislation, but I really respect the work that you and the flat rate for hire industry has done. A couple things you said that I just would challenge a bit. One is, you know, you mentioned a traditional unionized workforce with 15-minute breaks every 4 hours. Unions are also very democratic organizations, and the intent with this legislation is exactly that. And my hope would be that if a body of drivers chose to unionize, that they could set up a structure that said, no, we get breaks 5 times a day for prayer. We can take long periods of time off to go visit family. I mean, they can define the terms of their employment. It doesn't have to be a model from working in a machine shop in the 1950s. And the second thing is that this is not a city mandate that drivers will be in a union. What this says is if a majority of drivers for a company choose to be part of a collective bargaining unit, they could do that. And if the reality is that the vast majority of drivers for Uber think that things are going perfect right now and they don't want to change that, then they would never vote to be part of a collective bargaining. And if they did want to join it, it may be that the only thing we want to change as a group is that we get higher rates, or that we can't be disconnected from the system without 24 hours notice, or whatever they choose to do. But in the legislation, we specifically talk about whatever entity is representing these drivers has to be a democratic organization where the drivers have a voice to decide it. It's not going to be decided up on high.
And I wanted to follow up. So I do work for Teamsters Local 117. I think it's here on the screen. But many of our actual collective bargaining agreements with actual employers, not only do they include language for breaks for prayer, they also include facilities for prayer rooms, so that people can access, people can demonstrate their religious beliefs in the ways that they want to. And my only other follow-up would just be that when you are talking, everybody who takes an Uber or Lyft should definitely give their driver a high rating if they provide a high level of service, even if they tell the truth about the way that their day-to-day life is. I don't know how many people in the room, if I called you at work and I said, just tell me how much you love your job and how great it is, but at the end, I'm going to give you a rating, and if you say something bad, you might get fired. I don't know how many of you would be honest, but I would like for everybody who does use those services and who does talk to the drivers, please don't let a driver telling their actual story about their experience impact the rating that they get, because if they do get negative ratings, they can be eliminated, terminated, or deactivated, which is what it's called.
Robert, you have a question?
I didn't have a question. I have a point. Travis Kalanick, who runs Uber at TED 2 days ago, explain why the rates have come down and the benefit of reducing the rates. And he says that it pulled many times more customers into the customer pool, which means that the system got more efficient, so the driver would have more drives per hour than he had or she had before. And he said he's watching the data to see the overall income of the drivers, and he said it is going up. And I wonder how you're going to react when you don't have the data and he does, right?
That is one of the beautiful challenges of this whole dynamic. And so the idea that Travis, I don't know the gentleman, I read a few things about him. I tend to assume that everyone in our society are good people. But at the end of the day, his accountability is to his shareholders to maximize their profit. And yes, part of that is making sure that they have workers that do okay, but I don't trust that Travis every morning is waking up saying, how do I make sure my drivers are maximizing their take-home income? And so we have asked numerous times, we've actually required it in our legislation to get data. Uber has repeatedly refused to share it. The taxis, the taxis fill out paperwork for every single trip they do and where they picked them up and where they dropped them off and how much they charge. And that system's a little antiquated for sure, and we need to update that. But we require this of this industry, and Uber said, we're not going to give that to you, and nor has Lyft. And so, yeah, we don't have that information. And I just would say, folks, just because the owner of the company that's worth $63 billion, while his drivers are struggling, at least some of the drivers are saying that, because he says that they're doing fine, I don't think that it's responsible for me as a regulator to blindly trust that. I would love to have the data to see what's actually going on.
We have a question over here.
So, just real quick as a follow-up, it's a little disingenuous to talk about, to use the $1.35 per mile as, as a shock value, because they do also charge the customer 24 cents per minute that they're in the car, which is about $14 an hour. So that's in addition to what they're charging for the miles. I think it's something that should be, when you guys are in the public and you're talking to media, it should go out as something that is part of the charge, because it does bolster up the revenue that they make. As someone that used to hire a lot of independent contract drivers for a company that I owned, I did wake up every single day making sure that the 30 drivers that I worked with, every single day that they made the most money possible, because you don't have churn if you have that problem. And I think, just from my standpoint, sitting back here, it's easy to sit on a stage and have a shock value and say Detroit's 50 cents a mile, but at the end of the day, what's the total cost? Because there's also the minimum cost per ride, which is $4.20. 80% of that is $3.30. So if a driver was making $3 an hour, you're telling me they're doing one trip per hour that's less than 1 mile, and it seems like
So there's making and there's netting. So these guys have insurance,
Right.
they have vehicle payments, they have gas, they have maintenance. So I'm not saying that when they, the $3 an hour is after they do their tax return and deduct all the expenses that they're allowed to deduct, they're taking home, which is legitimate.
And almost every independent contractor I've ever worked with tries to make that number as low as possible to avoid paying income tax. I mean, that's the nature of being an independent contractor, is to take everything that you can, 56 cents a mile that the IRS allows, all of the car washes, everything that is involved in running your business, you're trying to drive that number down as low as possible to avoid paying the tax on it.
Well, but I think this is an important point, both ways, because there is a churn problem, and the retention, I think, can be lowered by treating the drivers. I don't use the word employee, I use the word customer. If they're not buying the Uber service in the sense that they're using the referrals, there's a clear signal back to Uber or Lyft or whomever. And so what we've done is we've moved from a market environment that was dyadic, where there was a seller and a buyer, to one where there's a marketplace, a provider and a customer. And the provider and customer in many ways are on the same level and probably should be talking about what the total impact on the community is. And that, I think, is an important point that we've learned from social media already, and is going to be influential in our job descriptions or our job configurations in the future.
Well, actually, it wasn't the marketplace before Uber was not a buyer and a seller. It was actually an independent contractor that was paying a daily fee to a dispatch company to get that money.
In that specific, I'm characterizing the on-demand space rather than.
Okay, but for taxes in general, for 25 plus years in Seattle, there was no legislation that was regulating the medallion owners, you know, contracting with independent contractors for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it just seems that now that there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room in some place where they can extract money from, we're going to go through and we're going to
We do regulate that. In fact, we require that the medallion owner cannot charge more than, I think, $65 a day to the person leasing the vehicle, because we felt that if they charged more than that, the driver couldn't make a living. And if the driver can't make a living to support his family, they're going to be in a position where they're going to cut corners, and that will impact safety. So we have been in that business. That's part of that.
But did you guys regulate the amount that Puget Sound Dispatch would charge back to the drivers as a dispatch fee? I don't think that was regulated. So and at the end of the day, and then there's gas and all that stuff on top of it. But it just seems like in the last 2 years, we have Uber, we have Lyft, and then we can jump out in front of GeekWire and all these places and say, oh my gosh, these guys aren't making any money. But at the end of the day, there wouldn't be 7,000 people contracting with Uber, doing it in their part-time. And if you go to other cities like San Francisco, the driver base is completely different. It's college students, it's part-time, it's stay-at-home moms. So all I'm saying is, you guys have a responsibility when you talk in front of folks like this. Just make sure that we're not just using the lowest possible number to get people to say, oh my gosh, this is the world's worst company, because it's not. I mean, there are certain outliers on both sides. There's probably drivers that make $30 an hour that only work Friday from 10 p.m. to 2 in the morning, right?
I think your points are well taken, and I don't think anybody's point, especially the drivers, is that this is a terrible company. People quit their jobs, invested in a vehicle, recruited their friends, and started working for these companies because they believed in it and they believed in the service. You mentioned 50 cents a mile in Detroit. It's actually 30. And the reason we point that out is not to say this is a shock, but just to say that if the city of Seattle said $2.70 per mile is the amount at which a driver could make less than $11 an hour, then $1.35, which is fully 50% less, is surely going to be under the minimum wage, especially when we're going from a market of 900 cars to over 9,000 cars. I'd also point out that the minimum when Uber first started in Seattle per mile, you said it was $4. Now it was $21 a mile, or $21 was the minimum when the company started. So just in contrast.
So, and
Right.
we can't debate every
Yeah, of
detail.
course.
So let's move on. Now, we only have a couple of minutes left. You've got a question here.
Hi, my name is Abdul Yusuf. I actually manage the for-hire industry, the biggest company called Eastside For-Hire that have several brands. It looks like the whole debate about what's going on, just like the gentleman said, just popped up for the last couple of years, like it's a new industry. This is an industry that I have actually, when I came to Seattle in 1993, from 95 until now, I've been part of it. The independence part of driving and doing the business as Henry Yates has been one thing that was very positive in our community in general. I do agree some of the points that Mike Bryan is talking about, that the dependency of full-time drivers with all these flux of drivers coming in has to be weighed in. But one of the biggest things that I have is ever since our independent business, the unions came in, which was even before Uber and Lyft came around, has become the most disastrous. The unions came in a driver community that are only taxis and for hires and have divided us and make one fight against the other. It was before this started. This is an independent. That's why we were trying to stay away from labor negotiations and those. So my question is, the city of Seattle have dealt with this industry throughout the time without not unionizing us. Why would the city now get involved and push the very thing that have divided among the communities that we're doing for living in front of Mike O'Brien during the testimonies between taxis and for hires? Unions were part of the biggest deficiencies among the community. And unions are another business for looking for more membership. And now what we see is that a smell of this.
So we only have about a minute left, so let's let Mike answer that question.
Right, so I will finalize it. Why wouldn't the city do what they used to do? Why are they bringing something that we call a cancer in our own community at the moment to even get involved with more, where they spell a prey of getting more members, which is another business that's coming along. Okay. Thank you very much.
You know, Abdul, my goal is to figure out how the voice of the drivers, and every driver has a different, unique situation, so I don't pretend like they're all unified, but that they have some leverage, some voice, some ability to come together. And I don't want to get in a back and forth about pros and cons of unions, but you know, there's some correlation between the rise of union membership and the creation of the middle class in this country. And there's certainly examples of where unions haven't acted in their best interest of their workers. But I think in general, the ability of workers to come together and have a collective voice to negotiate with folks that have, you know, $63 billion companies is a really important thing. And I think the decline of unions is also following the decline of the middle class in this country. And that doesn't mean we go back to 1950 and figure out how to do things, but I think we have to find ways for workers to have a voice.
And with that, I want to draw this to a close because we do have obligations to the next panel and a set of demos. But thank you very much for everybody. Your contribution has been fabulous. Your contribution from the audience has been fabulous as well. We were a little surprised by the emerging controversy around this. I'm glad it happened because it is a dialogue, and our future is going to be discussed and debated together, and we're going to go into it together, or we are going to go into it apart, and that would be an ugly outcome for this country. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation at our future events, and thank you everybody for your participation today. Thank you.